There have been 18 days in the Karen Reed trial so far, and now we get a few-day break to digest and think about all the evidence to prepare ourselves for Monday when the trial is going to be continuing. And a great way to spend that time would be to look through some of my daily recaps that I've been doing on this trial. Now, if you don't have that type of time, or maybe you're just new to the channel now, I have some great news for you. And that is that today, my goal, my mission is to recap the entire 18 days of trial in just one video and hopefully keep it under an hour. So if you're just fresh to the channel, fresh to the trial, don't worry. After this video, you are going to be already prepared to sit and watch the trial starting on Monday, or I should say continuing on Monday, of the Karen Reed trial. Now, before we jump into the analysis and the recap, I just want to make a few quick announcements. Number one, I'd like to give a congratulations to everyone who has been following me, viewing me, supporting me, subscribing, because today and really tomorrow is the 1-year anniversary from when I launched this channel. Brother Counsel's Analysis has been launched. This channel has been launched since May 31st, 2023. So I'd like to thank all of you who've been giving me the encouragement and support to continue doing all the hard work that it takes to put out these videos. And I appreciate all of the support and encouragement. I'd also like to give a special thank you to Michelle, who is a close friend, who does the work behind the scenes, helping me with the thumbnails, with some of the editing. So a very special thank you to Michelle. Also, in honor of our 1-year anniversary, we are rolling out something special, and that is we are going to be starting memberships for Brother Counsel. We're going to be calling it the Brother Counsel Sidebar. This is going to be my sidebars that I'm going to be having with the members to just add some additional content, some fun content. Hopefully, you're not going to be missing anything too major if you decide not to join the membership. We're still going to be giving out this analysis and recaps to the general public, but the membership is just something extra, some sidebars, as I like to call it, which will hopefully be some fun and hopefully be also educational. So just wanted to let you all know about that. And without any further ado, let's jump into the full 18-day recap of the Karen Reed trial. So we first heard from Paul and Aaron O'Keefe. Paul is John O'Keefe's brother who married Aaron. And they talked about Paul and John's sister, Kristen, who married Stephen Forbush. And tragically, very tragically, they both died within a few months of each other. And they had 2 children, Kaylee and Patrick. And John O'Keefe adopted essentially those 2 children, Kaylee and Patrick, to raise as his own. A very special man who can do that, and that's what he did. And they also spoke a little bit about the incident in Aruba, which we're going to be getting into a little bit later in the video. Then we heard from Stephen Saraf. Stephen Saraf was one of the first responding officers, and Stephen Saraf testified that he heard Karen Reed say, "This is all my fault. I did this." Wow, sounds like a confession to me, an admission to me. However, on cross-examination, it came out that actually his first statement seems to have been that all Karen Reed said was, "Is he dead?" And all of a sudden, it evolved later to, "This is my fault," and now it's evolving even further. So that was a point that was brought out in cross-examination. Then we heard from Stephen Mullaney. Stephen Mullaney was another responding officer, and he testified that all he heard Karen Reed say was, "Is he dead?" And a consistent theme that we're going to be hearing about throughout all these first responding officers and the paramedics was, did you see any taillights? Did you see any shoe? Did you see any hat? And they all testified that they didn't see any of that at the scene when they first responded. So that's what Stephen Mullaney testified. Then we had Timothy Nuttall. Timothy Nuttall was a paramedic, and in response to a question to Karen Reed, "Do you know him?" he testified that Karen Reed responded, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." And he also testified that John O'Keefe was wearing a big, heavy winter jacket. So for cross-examination, the defense pointed out, this was Alan Jackson's good line that he said during this cross-examination, was essentially, it was very clear that John O'Keefe did not wear that jacket. That is very clear from testimony later on. So he said, your memory that night is basically as good as your memory of him wearing a big, heavy winter jacket, isn't it? So essentially, whatever your memory is, that what she said is as good as your memory of him wearing a big, heavy jacket, which is not very good at all. All right. Now, another part that was brought out with his testimony was that he did not tell the hospital staff that Karen Reed may have hit John O'Keefe with the car. And that is very basic and important for a paramedic to tell the hospital what caused these injuries. And his testimony was that he did not share that information with the hospital staff. Then we had Anthony Flametti, who is another paramedic. And Anthony Flametti also testified that he heard Karen Reed say, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." And he, in fact, testified that he did tell the nurses and the doctors that Karen Reed said that, but he personally did not document that in his personal records or his personal report. And it's interesting that the hospital didn't either. So if Anthony Flametti would have told the hospital, it would seem very important for the hospital to document that somewhere. Nevertheless, the hospital records are void of any mention of Karen Reed possibly hitting John O'Keefe with the car. All right, then we had Kate McLaughlin. So Katie McLaughlin. She testified, she's also a paramedic. She testified that she was talking directly to Karen Reed, and Karen, in response to one of her questions, answered, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." And again, Katie McLaughlin decided not to document that anywhere. Also, some testimony came out that she was friends or friendly with Caitlin Albert. The defense is always going to try to draw some connections to the Albert family here. And her testimony was that she knows Caitlin. She wouldn't call her close friends. Maybe they're associates. Maybe they share friends, but she wouldn't consider her a close friend. Then we heard Gregory Woodbury. Gregory Woodbury was another paramedic who was called for the Section 12 on Karen. Karen was making some suicidal statements, and therefore they called the Section 12, and actually Karen was taken to the hospital. Now, while en route to the hospital, then we heard from Daniel Whitley. Daniel Whitley was with Karen, and Karen was talking very crazily. She was very hysterical. That's been consistent with all the testimony, that she was absolutely hysterical, nuts, running around crazy before the scene, at 34 Fairview. She was just absolutely beside herself. And Daniel was trying to calm her down and saying, you have a good support system here. I mean, look what happened. You called Jennifer McCabe, you called Carrie Roberts, that came out to help you search at 5 o'clock in the morning in the middle of a blizzard. You obviously have a good support system, so don't worry, everything's going to be fine. And her response to Daniel Whitley was, "Do you know Carrie Roberts?" And his response was yes. And then Karen Reed said, "Well, anybody who knows Carrie Roberts wouldn't say such things," which struck Daniel Whitley as strange. Why would Karen, who's completely beside herself, going nuts at the scene, all of a sudden throw out a dagger like that on Carrie Roberts? All right, moving on, we had Jason Becker, who was a paramedic. Jason Becker had a conversation with Karen Reed, and Karen Reed told him that the last conversation that she had with John O'Keefe was an argument. That was their last conversation. So there we're seeing that there was some fighting, some arguing going on right before John O'Keefe was found dead. All right, then we heard from Paul Gallagher. Paul Gallagher is a lieutenant at the Canton Police Department. And there's been some testimony that they've never really dealt with a homicide scene before. Seems that anytime it becomes into a homicide, they turn it over to the state police. But here he is at a homicide scene, or what's going to be potentially a homicide scene, and he needs to collect evidence. So what does he do? He gets a leaf blower, and he starts blowing around the snow to look for evidence. And what do you know? He actually discovers a cocktail glass, which we're going to hear about later, which is potentially what ties Karen Reed to this, because Karen Reed was carrying around a cocktail glass that night from the first establishment that she was at, C.F. McCarthy's, which eventually she seemed to have taken to the waterfall, which she probably ended up taking with her in the car when she was driving to 34 Fairview. So he did discover this cocktail glass, and then he also discovered some blood samples on the snow. So he saw some blood there, but how is he going to collect this blood which is on the snow? So his idea was to borrow some red Solo plastic cups and to gather the blood that way. And on cross-examination, it was a memorable moment when Alan Jackson said, "You mean the same type of red Solo plastic cup that you drink beer out of at a barbecue?" Trying to show how this is absolutely nuts, that this is how you would collect evidence. All right. Now, also, he was asked, why didn't he search the Alberts' home? And he said, well, you have to get a search warrant. Well, a search warrant requires probable cause. And there is no way in his mind that there'd be any sort of probable cause to search the Alberts' house. And that's why he didn't even bother even trying to get a search warrant to search the Alberts' house. Now, another blunder by the Canton Police Department was the fact that they took custody of Karen Reed's SUV Lexus. They brought it into the Canton Police Department, and they neglected to take pictures of it as it came in to the police department, which would be essential. It's basic. You take pictures of the evidence before you tamper with it, before you start inspecting it, before you're doing any sort of investigation on the evidence. You take pictures to show what it looked like before and what it looked like after. And they failed to take pictures of the Lexus SUV before it came into before they did any sort of investigation or tampering with it. All right. Then we had Sergeant Good. Sergeant Good, he also works for the Canton Police Department. He also responded to the scene, and he was the one who sent Jennifer McCabe to wake up the Alberts, which is also a big no-no. You don't want to have witnesses together with each other. You always have to separate and seclude the witnesses from each other. Nevertheless, he sent in Jennifer McCabe to wake up Brian Albert and Nicole Albert. And he testified that when he did see Brian and Nicole Albert, they looked like they just woke up. Now, it was also brought out in the cross-examination that on the report, he spelled Brian Albert's name differently. I mean, he didn't spell his entire first and last name. I believe he just wrote B. Albert. And also Brian Higgins, he didn't list Brian Higgins' home address, which he did for all the other witnesses. He listed his office address, which is interesting if he is a regular witness. So you see already some different treatment to Brian Albert and Brian Higgins from Sergeant Good. All right, then we heard from Sergeant Lank. Sergeant Lank is good friends with Chris Albert. And this came out, he acknowledged it, and there was an incident in which there was an altercation between Chris Albert and some other individuals, and Sergeant Lank came to Chris Albert's defense and actually got into a fist fight with these individuals. Now, there's been different stories about exactly what happened at that case, but what certainly did come out in trial was that these two individuals that got into a fist fight with Sergeant Lank eventually sued Sergeant Lank in civil rights violations. And there was a settlement on that case. It wasn't dismissed, it was a settlement. But of course, the details of the settlement are confidential, like they always are. So we don't know the details of how much the settlement was. And of course, in every settlement agreement, you don't acknowledge liability. So, but we can kind of draw some reasonable conclusions from that situation. So you have Sergeant Lank sticking up for Chris Albert in this fight. He was sued by those people. And Sergeant Lank was the sergeant who he was at 34 Fairview, and he went to go speak to the Alberts and McCabe's all together that morning, not separating them, just kind of spoke to them all together about what happened. And he testified that the house looked normal inside. It didn't look like there's any broken glass or any sort of altercation that happened, although this was, again, hours and hours later from the alleged time when this altercation, according to the defense, happened. Now, Chief Berkowitz called him back to the scene at 34 Fairview on February 4th, when at that point the snow already melted, and that's when they found the broken taillight. So many days passed since the scene was unsecured, and then all of a sudden, February 4th, wouldn't you know it, they found some broken taillight there. So that was the defense's point there, that anybody had access to that scene. Nevertheless, his testimony was that the reason why they came back later was because the snow melted, and that's where they're able to see a much clearer view of everything going on in that front lawn, and that's when they discovered the broken pieces of taillight. Now, also, he was asked why didn't he get a search warrant for the house, and he also testified that there is no way that there was probable cause to search that house. And like I said in my videos, that is a little questionable because there probably is some pretty good chance of probable cause to be able to search that house, but their testimony was that there was no way. They didn't even bother because it was so clear that there's no probable cause at all to be able to search that house. All right. So then we heard from Michael Camerano. Michael Camerano was a friend of John O'Keefe. Both of their daughters were friends with each other, and they both got into the same high school. It was a very exciting day. They both wanted to celebrate. They went out to C.F. McCarthy's together to drink. And also Karen Reed joined John and Michael there at C.F. McCarthy's, which eventually later John O'Keefe and Karen Reed went to the waterfall. Now, he woke up the next morning getting a phone call from his wife, whose wife was working the night shift. She was a nurse, Catherine Camerano, and Catherine Camerano, also who took the stand right after him, said that she was getting phone calls from Karen Reed, and Karen Reed was absolutely frantic on the phone, frantic and hysterical. And this has been consistent with everyone's testimony, that Karen was absolutely frantic and hysterical, and I guess according to the state, this is all one big show. But all the testimony was that she was going frantic. She was calling Catherine and she was asking, "Where's Mike?" 100 times. "Where's Mike? Where's Mike? Where's Mike?" Because John didn't come home, and she knew Karen Reed knew that they were together. Michael Camerano was together with John O'Keefe. Then we heard from Nicholas Kolakithis, who actually is an attorney himself, but he was at the waterfall, and he testified that they looked very happy together. And this has also been consistent, that John O'Keefe and Karen Reed looked very happy. No disagreements there, no sense of anything, any issues with their relationship at all. Everyone testified that they seemed to be very happy with each other at the waterfall. In fact, Nicholas Kilakithis testified that his wife actually complained to him that he is not showing as much affection as John is showing to Karen, or vice versa. So that's what his testimony was. He said Karen was singing John's praises. And Karina was also saying that Karen was saying how much she admired John for taking in his nephew and niece, and she just wished that some other family members of John O'Keefe would help out a little bit more, because it seems like John's taking on the entire burden all himself, and other family members are not helping out with those two children, Kaylee and Patrick. And at some point, Karina testified that Jennifer McCabe put her arm around Karen as they were leaving the waterfall, and put her arm around Karen and said, "You're coming with me," and said a little bit forceful. And when Karen said, where are we going? She said something to the effect that it will be a surprise. So that is the testimony of Karina Kolakithis. So then we heard from Chris Albert. Chris Albert is the owner of a pizza store, which is very close to the waterfall. And they all were getting together at the waterfall. What was the purpose of that? Because Brian Albert Jr. was had a birthday. Now, according to Chris Albert, what he testified was that he was actually turning 21. That's what he thinks, that Brian Albert Jr. was turning 21. And the reason why, after the waterfall, Karen wanted to go to the pizza store is because they had a ritual that when somebody turns 21, they go to the pizza store and celebrate and make more pizza or something after closing. They all get together and do that. So Karen really wanted to do that. Nothing to do, and he didn't want to do it because there was a weight loss challenge going on that he was part of. He was trying to lose weight, so therefore he didn't want to be around freshly baked pizza. And neither, also Matt McCabe testified for the same thing. He was also had a weight loss challenge that they always do every single year, and that's why they didn't want to go to the pizza store. He also testified that Karen took out a drink from her coat, and this has also been a number of witnesses testified that Karen seemed to have stolen a glass from C.F. McCarthy's and brought it to the waterfall with her drink, whatever the drink is, presumably vodka of some sort of mix. And she took it out. So that doesn't obviously paint her in the greatest light in front of the jury. So he testified to that. Now, Chris Albert testified that his wife, Julie Albert, went home early that night because she had a migraine, and then he came home later. So he did not go to 34 Fairview. So he went home after the waterfall. But Chris has a son, and the son's name is Colin Albert. Colin Albert did go to 34 Fairview, and he went there because he was celebrating Brian Albert Jr.'s birthday. Now, what's interesting here is that Brian Albert Jr.'s birthday, where Brian Albert was celebrating it, Brian Albert Jr., that is, he was celebrating it at 34 Fairview at home, and he had some friends over at home. But the rest of the Albert and McCabe family, they went out to the waterfall to celebrate his birthday. That's what seems to have been the story here. Now, Colin went to say happy birthday, maybe have some drinks, and then Colin Albert came home. And this was Chris's testimony, that Colin came home, he popped his head into the bedroom, said goodnight, and off he went to bed. The next thing Chris Albert remembers is that his wife woke him up because his wife, Julie Albert, went to 34 Fairview, and where she was told the information about what happened. And therefore, Julie came back, woke up Chris, and then together they went to 34 Fairview. Now, he did acknowledge that he was friends with Michael Proctor and Chief Berkowitz. And also what was interesting is that Chris Albert, his testimony was that he just got John O'Keefe's number, on January 28th. Even though they were living on the same block for a while, he only got his number on January 28th. Now, there was some discussion about John being the get off my lawn guy, and some jokes about Mr. Nevercracker. And this is where I discussed that it seems to be that the defense overplayed their hand in this, because it seemed to have come out very clearly that this is all one big joke. Everyone was friendly with each other. John O'Keefe one time seemed to have just made a joke, the fact that Dylan Chris Albert's son, Dylan Albert, ran across his lawn, and he made some sort of joke like, hey, get off my lawn. And Dylan was really shaken up by it. So John came over with some chocolates and tried to cheer him up. And since then, it was always like some sort of joke between them that he's the get off my lawn guy, Mr. Nevercracker. And they always used to make jokes about that. But didn't seem like there's anything really serious or any serious animosity between Chris Albert and his family and John O'Keefe. All right. Then we heard from Julie Albert. Julie Albert testified that actually it's not really a ritual for them to go make pizza. It's just something that it's a ritual on somebody turns 21. That's actually not what's going on. They just sometimes go to make some pizza together after closing because that's what friends do. You know, you own a pizza store. Let's go hang out at the pizza store. So that is what her testimony was. And she testified that she did have a migraine and she went home early because there was a live band at the waterfall and she was just getting a migraine. So she went home. And she also testified that Colin did come home and came up to her room and asked about her migraine. So a little bit of an inconsistency between Chris Albert's story and Julie Albert's story. Chris Albert said that he poked his head in the room and said goodnight. And Julie Albert said that he poked his head in the room and said, how are you feeling? Are you feeling any better? And the question is, how did he find out about Julie Albert's migraine? Maybe she texted him about it. Okay. So a little bit of a difference of the story about what exactly the interaction between Colin and Julie and Chris Albert were before Colin went to sleep. Now, Julie Albert has her own personal ritual, nothing to do with the pizza store. Her ritual is that anytime it's Brian Albert Jr.'s birthday, what she does is that she buys 6 donuts from Dunkin' Donuts, 6 donuts for some reason, and she brings those donuts over to Brian Albert Jr. And that's what she was doing this morning. She didn't know anything about what happened the night before. Remember, she just went home after the waterfall, went to sleep, and she did have some missed calls from her good friend Jennifer McKay, but she chose not to call her back, and she just went to get donuts. Okay, so she got some missed calls from Jennifer McKay at like 5 o'clock in the morning, but she figured, it's probably nothing, and she didn't even call her back before she went to get donuts at Dunkin' Donuts, brought the 6 donuts over to Brian Albert Sr.'s house, 34 Fairview, and was just going to drop them off in Brian Albert Jr.'s car. So first of all, she must have known that the car was open somehow, but that was her testimony. And then she said that while she was there, Brian Albert Sr. came out of the house and said, come into the house, we need to talk to you. And then once she got into the house, Jennifer McCabe was the one to tell Julie Albert about what happened. And therefore, Julie Albert went home, got Chris Albert, brought him back to 34 Fairview, and eventually was interviewed by the police. All right. Now, they do have some strong connections to the Proctors. This was brought out in cross-examination. They went to the Proctor's pool together. So there is a connection there between Julie, Chris Albert, and the Proctors. Now, also, what's interesting is that she's friends with Courtney Proctor. So, and Julie Albert, there's some phone records that show that she made a number of different phone calls to Courtney Proctor a few times before Karen Reed was arraigned and after Karen Reed was arraigned. And one of the phone calls actually lasted, I think it was like 22 minutes. So it was a long phone call afterwards, but Julie Albert did not recall anything that they spoke about on that day that Karen Reed was arraigned. And she doesn't think specifically had anything to do with the investigation or anything like that. All right. Or anything to do with the case. All right. So now moving on. Then we heard from Nicole Albert. Nicole Albert is Brian Albert Sr.'s wife, and she testified that really, when they were at the waterfall, she really only invited Jennifer McCabe to come over to 34 Fairview and wish Brian Albert Jr. a happy birthday. But of course, if anybody else wanted to come, they were welcome to come as well. And she also testified that when she did get home, Colin Albert was on his way out, so he left, and even though she didn't mention that to the police, she didn't really feel like he was really there to tell the police that Colin Albert was one of the people there, because he really just left as soon as she came home that night. Now, she did testify that everybody really hung out for the most part in the kitchen area, and at one point, Brian Higgins and Brian Albert left the kitchen area just for a few minutes. What they did, she doesn't know, but they did leave the kitchen for a couple of minutes. Now, something interesting is that they left their door unlocked that night, and this is typical. And this was the testimony that a lot of times Brian and Nicole Albert leave their house unlocked, and that's what they did that night. Now, in the morning, they didn't see anything outside. They didn't hear anything outside. They were awoken by Jennifer McCabe bursting into the room. And this is their words, not mine. That Jennifer McCabe burst into the room and was hysterical. That was Nicole Albert's testimony. And they also had a German Shepherd, Chloe. So Nicole Albert and Brian Albert had a German Shepherd named Chloe, and the testimony was that Chloe slept in the bedroom. And what exactly happened to Chloe when Jennifer McCabe burst into the room, it's not clear at all. Nevertheless, there's some testimony about Chloe being friendly with people or not being friendly with people, and Nicole Albert's testimony was that really Chloe is completely fine with strangers who are humans. Her only issue is with strange dogs. And the only time that there was any sort of incident with Chloe, and there was an incident where some people ended up in the hospital because of Chloe, was only because Chloe was in a fight with those people's dogs. And then eventually Chloe turned against the owners of the dogs. Now, there were some phone records that also showed that there was a phone call between Jennifer McCabe and Nicole Albert at 6:07 and 6:08 a.m. That was before Jennifer McCabe went to wake them up. And Nicole Albert adamantly denies receiving any sort of phone call or speaking to Jennifer McCabe until she actually burst into her room. Then we heard from Brian Albert. Brian Albert, that is the owner of the house, him and Nicole, at 34 Fairview. Now, his testimony was that earlier that day, he was at a funeral for a fallen police officer. He was there with Brian Higgins, which we're going to hear about more later. And together they drove back from the funeral in New York back to Canton. And they first went together to the hillside. And after the hillside, then they went to the waterfall. And at the waterfall, they were hanging out. And after the waterfall was about to close, or near the end of when the waterfall was about to close, Brian Albert invited the entire table to come back to 34 Fairview to continue the party, say happy birthday to Brian Albert Jr. And while back at the house, eventually he did show Brian Higgins some pictures of his son who is in the Marine Corps. So Brian Albert has a son who's in the Marine Corps, and both Brian Albert and Brian Higgins were in the Marine Corps themselves. So they were looking at some pictures. Brian Albert was showing Brian Higgins some pictures of his son in the Marine Corps, and guess maybe reminiscing about their time in the Marine Corps. And that happened in his son's room upstairs. That is Brian Albert's testimony. And then after that, Brian Higgins left. So there was some records of some phone calls being made between Brian Albert and Brian Higgins at around 2 o'clock in the morning, and he adamantly denies ever making a phone call or receiving a phone call. The only explanation that he can understand is that it was a butt dial. All right, eventually Jennifer McCabe burst into the room to wake him up. That's how he woke up. And it has nothing to do, he did not hear Karen Reed screaming outside, even though we're going to hear later that Matt and Jennifer McCabe said that Karen came to their house first and was screaming so loud that Matt McCabe was scared that she was going to wake up the neighborhood. That's how loud and hysterical she was being. But when she got to 34 Fairview, apparently it was not as loud because it did not wake up Brian or Nicole Albert. That was their testimony. And also they did not wake up from all of the lights and the sirens, even though there was no sounds, but there was all those lights from all of the police vehicles, the ambulances, the fire trucks, and they didn't wake up from any of those, even though their bedroom window was right opposite where all those lights would be coming into their room. And their also testimony was that they don't sleep with any blinders, any face masks, or anything like that. But that was their testimony, so that is what we're going to go with. Now, there was some discussion about Brian Albert selling his house, because eventually he did sell that house on 34 Fairview. So why did he sell this house? He sold the house in 2023. Doesn't that look a little interesting? And his answer to that was no, they were actually looking to sell their house since 2021, because that's when his brother Chris Albert sold his house and he got a good deal. He sold it pretty quickly. So they already were discussing this in 2021, just it never actually materialized to a sale till 2023. But obviously nothing to do with this investigation or this murder. He also testified that Brian Higgins never spoke to him about Karen Reed. And this is going to be significant as we hear more about what happened between Brian Higgins and Karen Reed. He also testified that he got rid of his phone literally a day or two before there was a preservation order. There's a preservation order entered in this case some September, I think it was September 30th. And just a day or two before that, that is when Brian Albert got rid of his phone, just coincidentally. And also there's testimony that he was in the Marine Corps and he was a boxer, so he didn't know how to fight and how to subdue somebody. And also there's some testimony that there was the cell phone reception in their house was terrible. So maybe that will kind of explain these phone calls or these alleged phone calls or these 22-second phone calls that nobody was talking to or answering because the cell phone reception was so terrible. All right. So that's what we heard from Brian Albert. Then we heard from Brian Albert Jr. Brian Albert Jr. testified that he was actually turning 23. So this whole idea that there's a ritual when this person turns 21 is obviously not exactly true. So he was turning 23 at the time. He did testify that he saw Karen's car outside, initially closer to the mailbox, and then it moved up. And this is also going to be a consistent testimony that Karen Reed's car started off near the mailbox and then moved up closer to where the flagpole is. All right, then we heard from Caitlin Albert. Caitlin Albert was the last person to leave 34 Fairview. And she was picked up by her boyfriend, Tristan Morris. And when she was leaving, she did not see any body on the lawn. So where John O'Keefe's body would be, and this has been also consistent with all of the people that were leaving that night, late at night, 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning, nobody saw a 6'2" figure on the middle of the lawn. So that was her testimony. She also did testify that she does know Katie McLaughlin. They're friendly, wouldn't consider themselves friends or close friends, but sure, they know each other and they share friends. Then we had Tristan Morris. Tristan Morris was the boyfriend for Caitlin Albert, who picked up Caitlin Albert. And how he ended up there was a little interesting because Tristan Morris really was supposed to be going to sleep early that night because he was supposed to be waking up early the next morning to do plowing. That was one of the jobs that he did was he was a plow. He operated a plow. And since there was a blizzard coming in, so he was going to have to wake up early to do some plowing. Nevertheless, Caitlin was texting him to pick her up. And he said, well, she's very high maintenance, and that's why he was going to go pick her up, even though it made very little sense for him to be in touch with her and to pick her up. But, that's what you do. You're a boyfriend, and you do that. Now, what was interesting about Tristan Morris is that he never wanted to commit to any sort of time at all. He didn't remember any times at all throughout the entire night. He couldn't tell you whether he did something closer to 9 p.m. or 3 o'clock in the morning. It was completely no recollection of any times. And he also testified that even though he was there to pick up Caitlin Albert, he did not notice anything on the front lawn either, any body of John O'Keefe. Certainly not that. All right, then we had Sarah Levinson. Sarah Levinson was one of the girls who went to celebrate Brian Albert Jr.'s birthday at 34 Fairview. She was there, and when she left, she didn't see anything on the lawn. Then we had Julie Nagel. Julie Nagel was also one of the friends of Brian Albert Jr., and she also testified that she did see Karen Reed's car initially closer to the mailbox, and then it did move up closer to the flagpole, consistent with what we've been hearing up until now. And initially, she texted her brother, Ryan Nagel, to pick her up, and then when Ryan Nagel came with his friend, Rick D'Antano, she came out, said, you know what, I want to stay here. You guys just go home. And again, she testified that she did not see any body on the front lawn. Now, here's where it gets a little interesting because when she did eventually go home with Matt and Jennifer McCabe, she did say in the car, this was her testimony, that she said in the car that I think I saw a black object in the lawn. And nobody really cared. So that's what she testified to. But she said that the next day, she did put two and two together, and she realized that must have been John O'Keefe. Now, she was asked also on I think it was direct examination, if you would have seen a body there, what would you have done? And she said, I would have called 911. And then the next day, when she did put two and two together, she did not call 911. So that was a question with her testimony. All right, then we heard from Terry Kuhn, who is a veterinary DNA expert, and she tested some of the samples that the state sent her. And again, she only tested what the state sent her. They sent her 2 samples, and she did not find any canine DNA on what she tested. She actually did find some pig traces on some of the things that she tested, but she did not find any canine DNA, which also would hurt the defense's case here, that their argument is that those scratches on John O'Keefe's arm are related to a dog, either a dog bite or a dog scratch. And one of the lines on cross-examination here was that if it was a dog scratch, then there's a very likely that you would not find DNA on those scratches. All right, but again, and also you're only limited to whatever the state sent you to test. So we don't know exactly everything that the state tested. What did they test already? A jacket, a shirt? So that is not, that also came out on cross-examination. Then we heard from Ryan Nagel and Rick D'Antano, very similar testimony. And that again, they did testify that Karen's car was there closer to the mailbox, then it moved up. They both actually came to 34 Fairview at the same time. Karen Reed's car, they let go first, and then they pulled up behind her. And they did not see any car between their F-150 and Karen Reed's SUV, which is going to be inconsistent with some of the testimony we're going to be hearing about a little bit later. So they did not see Brian Higgins' Jeep, for example, with a plow between their cars. All right, now, when they were passing by, they were eventually left because Julie Nagel came out and said, you know what, I don't need your ride. I'm going to get a ride later with Jennifer and Matt McCabe. And they were passing Karen Reed's SUV, and Ryan Nagel looked inside the SUV because the dome light was on. Well, his testimony was that he was actually looking to make sure that his sister got in the house okay, but whatever. The point is that he looked in and saw that the dome light was on, the interior light was on in Karen Reed's car, and he did see Karen Reed, but he did not see any John O'Keefe or any male there at all. Then we heard from Allison McCabe. Allison McCabe testified that she absolutely, 100%, picked up Colin Albert from 34 Fairview. And Colin texted her to pick her up. She came and picked him up and drove him straight home, and then drove herself straight home as well. However, on cross-examination, they brought out that on this app called the Life 360, which tracks where your children are, which is an app that Allison McCabe has on her phone, the records there show that she was actually out and about and not home at 12:15, 12:30ish when she said she was. She was actually out and around at different places. But the accuracy of that app is really questionable. There's some notation on their report about the Wi-Fi maybe being off, and therefore maybe not being so accurate. Now, because the defense opened up the door in some way by Allison McCabe's testimony, there was some evidence, some testimony about the harassment that Allison McCabe experienced because of Turtle Boy and some of the other conspiracy theories in this case, and she talked about that, and she seemed very authentic, and it certainly made an impression on the jury. So not something that the defense wanted to come out, but nevertheless it did come out. Then we had Colin Albert testify. Colin Albert testified that he absolutely texted Allie McCabe to give him a ride. She came, picked him up, but there was no more texts between Colin Albert and Allison McCabe for about a full month after that incident, which is interesting. And the response here, the testimony here, was that we were just communicating on other ways to communicate, with Snapchat or some other ways to communicate, but not through regular text messages. And there was testimony that they were both very, very good friends, maybe perhaps even best friends. And for you to not text your good, very best friend within, from the last text 4 weeks, that is certainly questionable. He also testified that he was the ring bearer at Courtney Proctor's wedding, showing the connection between the Albert and the Proctor family. There was also some pictures that were shown to him of his knuckles being bruised, showing that he's a violent individual. His explanation to that was that he was just punching a punching bag, and that's why his knuckles got sore and bruised in those pictures. Also, those pictures were February 26th. It was a long time after this incident with John O'Keefe. There's also some videos of him kind of trying to be a tough guy and talking to some another club hockey team or whatever it was, and threatening them that he's going to hurt them or whatever it is. So there was some testimony that came out. Again, not such strong indication that he's a violent person, because it's just teenagers doing what teenagers do. Anyway, moving on. So then we had Matt McCabe take the stand. Matt McCabe testified that he also looked out the window a number of times, and he noticed that Karen Reed's car did start off by the mailbox and moved up eventually. But he testified that Brian Higgins' Jeep was actually between Ryan Nagel's and Rick D'Antano's F-150 and Karen Reed's SUV. He also testified that he did not see any body on the lawn, and he did not hear Julie Nagel say anything about a black object being in the middle of the lawn when they eventually left that night. Now, Matt McCabe awoke the next day, even though he left around 2 o'clock in the morning, 1:45, 2 o'clock in the morning, didn't notice any body on the lawn, and he awoke to Karen Reed screaming into the phone to Jennifer McCabe, Jen, 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 and she was absolutely going hysterical. And she actually said, he overheard, that Karen was telling Jen that the last time that Karen saw John O'Keefe was at the waterfall, which seems strange to him because he knows that they went to 34 Fairview, and Karen Reed said, well, she doesn't remember going to 34 Fairview. And then she told Jen about a broken taillight that she has on her vehicle. The next thing that he knows, Karen Reed is screaming outside of his house. So Karen Reed made her way over to Matt and Jennifer McCabe's house, and she was yelling in the front lawn, and he was concerned that her yelling was going to wake up the entire neighborhood. This was 5 o'clock in the morning. And Jennifer McCabe decides that she is going to go with Karen Reed and Carrie Roberts to look for John O'Keefe. 5 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of a blizzard, no problem. That's what friends are for. Next time Matt McCabe speaks to Jennifer McCabe is an hour later, which I thought was a little interesting that he would wait an entire hour to get in touch again with his wife when his wife left in the middle of a blizzard looking for a lost person. Nevertheless, that was his testimony. He also testified that Jennifer McCabe stays very calm in crisis. When a crisis is happening, she just has that knack. She's able to stay cool, calm, and collective. This is interesting because Jennifer McCabe, also the testimony was from Brian and Nicole Albert, that she burst into their bedroom room and was hysterical. So which one is it? Although from the dash cams, it seems that Jennifer McCabe is very calm, but Brian and Nicole Albert's testimony was that when she got into the house, she was not calm at all. So that's something to think about. So Matt McCabe was told by Jennifer McCabe that they found John O'Keefe about an hour later from looking for him, and Matt McCabe goes to 34 Fairview. Eventually, he talks to the police there, and he is interviewed later by Michael Proctor, Trooper Michael Proctor. And then there were some text messages and some group text messages between Matt McCabe and Jennifer McCabe and Brian and Nicole Albert. And the defense tried to show that there's some sort of conspiracy, nothing like a smoking gun. There were some questions about, questionable text back and forth, but nothing like that shows you clearly that they were all conspiring together to do anything. All right. Then we had Jennifer McCabe. So Jennifer McCabe testified, and Jennifer McCabe was the first person who testified that the mood between John and Karen that night, although it seemed very happy and there was no disagreements or anything like that, but Karen Reed was confiding in Jennifer McCabe and sharing some of the frustration that she had with John O'Keefe. And they were talking about raising children, and John O'Keefe was very nervous that Karen was spoiling the kids. And this was kind of the discussion that she was having with Jennifer McCabe. So we do find some frustration that Karen was having and sharing with Jennifer McCabe that night. Now, eventually, when they both went to 34 Fairview, Jennifer McCabe, first of all, testified that she did not force Karen to say, it wasn't forceful to say, you're coming with me and it's going to be a surprise, you better come with me. She was just saying, hey, why don't you come with me? Matt will go with John and we'll meet together at the 34 Fairview. Like, it wasn't forceful or anything like that. And then eventually when they did go to 34 Fairview, she saw John O'Keefe in Karen's car. She saw Karen's SUV there, and she texted John a number of times, come on in, are you here, pull behind me, all these texts to say, oh, hey, you're here, come on in, we're waiting for you, or just park over there, come on in, and there was no response. Now, eventually, she did not see her car there anymore, so she understood that they left. Now, when she left at 2 a.m., Jennifer McCabe, when she left at 2 a.m., she did not see any body on the lawn. And her testimony was that while she was walking to the car, she didn't see anything. And then when she got into the car, she really turned to talk to the two girls that she was bringing home, Sarah Levinson and Julie Nagel. She turned to them so her back essentially would be facing the front lawn, and that's how she could not see John O'Keefe's body there. Now, Kaylee calls her. Remember, Kaylee is John O'Keefe's niece. Kaylee calls her, and she hears Karen. Kaylee calls Jennifer McCabe. Jennifer McCabe hears Karen Reed screaming in the background, Jen, Jen, Jen. And she tells him that Karen Reed tells Jennifer McCabe that they got into a fight. Karen Reed and John O'Keefe got into a fight at the waterfall, and that she left him at the waterfall. And then she was saying, well, didn't you come with us to 34 Fairview? I saw your car there. And then she says that, oh, maybe we did. I don't remember. And then she kept saying over and over again, could I have hit him? Did I hit him? What if I hit him? Could I have hit him? Just kept repeating these questions. Maybe I hit him. Did I hit him? All those types of questions. And then when she eventually goes to Jennifer McCabe's house, when Karen Reed goes to Jennifer McCabe's house, she shows Jennifer McCabe her broken taillight. So she shows her the broken taillight, and she tells her about the broken taillight. And then when they eventually go to 34 Fairview, first they go to John O'Keefe's house, they're searching around, okay, and then they go to 34 Fairview because Karen is insistent on going to 34 Fairview. They go to 34 Fairview, and Karen's sitting in the back seat, and Jennifer McCabe and Carrie Roberts, who they meet up with, is sitting in the front seat. So Karen's in the back, Carrie and Jen are in the front. And Karen's completely hysterical, and Jennifer McCabe doesn't understand how Karen can even look out the window, and there's a blizzard going on, and all of a sudden Karen says, I see him, I see him, I see him. They both look like she's nuts because they don't see anything, and Karen Reed runs out to the lawn on 34 Fairview, and that's where she discovers John O'Keefe's body. And eventually when the paramedics come, she does say, this is what Jennifer McCabe says, that she overheard Karen Reed saying to the paramedic, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him, without any question mark. There was no question about it. It was a statement. I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. And at that point, eventually at some point, she's just going nuts. Karen Reed, she gets into a patrol car. They get together, they're praying. And then at some point, Karen tells Jennifer McCabe, Google how long to die in cold. And this only happened at 6 o'clock in the morning after they discovered the body. That was Jennifer McCabe's testimony. Now, she also testified that it's typical for the Albert home, Brian and Nicole Albert, to leave their door unlocked. So it's very strange, but she says that is typical for them. And even though she ran upstairs and burst into the house, burst into their bedroom, Jennifer McCabe does not remember anything that Chloe the dog was doing. She doesn't remember anything, any reaction or anything about Chloe the dog. So where exactly was Chloe the dog? That is a big question in this case. She also testified that Brian Higgins' Jeep was behind Karen's car. So she also agreed with that testimony. That it wasn't just Ryan Nagel, Rick D'Antonio's F-150, and then Karen Reed's car. It was actually Brian Higgins' Jeep between the two. And she also testified that she did not see anybody when she was leaving, as we spoke about. And she also never heard Julie Nagel say anything about a black object in the car. Now, there's a Celebrate report, the phone extraction, which shows that Jennifer McCabe had a conversation with Nicole Albert, or called her at 6:07, 6:08 a.m. And she says that she did not call her then. And the Celebrate report shows that those calls actually were deleted. And the Celebrate report also shows that there was a Google search at 2:27 in the morning, how long to die in cold, actually how long to die in cold, and that search was also deleted. And Jennifer McCabe said, I never deleted anything. I don't know how it's coming up as deleted. And I never searched at 2:27 in the morning. I only searched when Karen Reed asked me to search at 6 o'clock in the morning. And it seems that the prosecution's case, the state's case, is going to be that since she used a same tab, she did go home the night before at 2:27 and was searching for other stuff. She was looking up basketball stuff and whatever because her kids are in basketball. So she was looking up that. But since she never closed that tab and searched the next morning on that same tab that she opened at 2:27 in the morning, she searched how long to die in cold. So that's why it's coming up as 2:27. That's what seems to be the state's case or state's argument that they're going to argue why it's coming up as a 2:27 a.m. search. Now, also, there was some group texting between Jennifer McCabe, Matt McCabe, Brian Albert, and Nicole Albert. And at one point, there was some back and forth about whether they were listening in on each other's interviews. And here, Jennifer McCabe texts the group while Carrie Roberts is being interviewed in her house. Jennifer McCabe texts, she is telling him everything in caps, which shows that she's listening in on the conversation between Carrie Roberts and the police officer, Trooper Michael Proctor. And she tried to get out of this by saying, no, she didn't really know for sure. She just heard a lot of mumbling, but not actually hearing every single word. And then it came out that, no, she actually was hearing bits and pieces, and that's what she was saying, that she's saying that Carrie Roberts is a big talker. And then she tried to explain that really what she meant by she is telling him everything was the fact that Carrie Roberts was saying how she felt about the relationship between John O'Keefe and Karen Reed, which Carrie Roberts felt that their relationship is the fact that John O'Keefe doesn't really love Karen Reed. John O'Keefe is in love with another woman named Amy. And really, Karen Reed is just a babysitter with benefits. And that's what Carrie Roberts said. And it absolutely horrified Jennifer McCabe that she would say such a thing, that it prompted her to text, "I'm horrified." No, it didn't text. No, that's not what she texted. She texted, "She is telling him everything." That's what her explanation was for that text. All right. Now, there's another thing that Jennifer McCabe went to Elizabeth Proctor's home at September of 2023. And Elizabeth Proctor is Michael Proctor's wife. Doesn't that look strange? But she explained that no, the reason why she was going to Elizabeth Proctor's home was because they were both being so harassed by what Turtle Boy was putting out and all these conspiracy theories that it was just getting so crazy that they wanted each other's support and to talk about what they're going to do about it. So that's why she went to visit Elizabeth Proctor that day. And at some point, they got together and wrote timelines. They wrote some timelines, and she explained that the reason why they all wrote timelines was because, not because they're having some sort of conspiracy here, but it's because John O'Keefe's mother, Peggy O'Keefe, told them that it's a good idea for them to write timelines so they won't forget when trial comes around. Then we heard from Carrie Roberts. Carrie Roberts also was one of the women that at 5 o'clock in the morning conducted the search to find John O'Keefe. And what Carrie Roberts testified was that Karen Reed suggested that it's possible, when she first called Carrie Roberts, that John O'Keefe got hit by a plow. So that was her story or possibility to Carrie Roberts. She also told Carrie Roberts that she doesn't really remember much from the night before because she was so drunk, because she drank so much. Now, Carrie Roberts also testified that she saw a little black hole by Karen Reed's taillight. So not that she saw an entire cracked, broken taillight, but her testimony was that she saw a little black hole. All right. Then we heard from Laura Sullivan and Marietta Sullivan. Laura Sullivan was a girlfriend of John O'Keefe's best friend who hurt himself, and they had a baby together, actually, first. That's Laura Sullivan and John O'Keefe's best friend. And John O'Keefe was the godfather of that son, that baby, and he was very close with the family. And they were all together in Aruba. This is where the Aruba incident came up. So Laura Sullivan talked about it. Marietta Sullivan talked about it. And at some point, John O'Keefe was giving a hug to Marietta Sullivan. And Marietta Sullivan's testimony was that it was just a friendly hug. John O'Keefe is like an older brother to them, and that's why he was giving her that hug. But Karen Reed understood that hug to be much more than just a friendly hug, and she thought that maybe they were even making out or doing other stuff. So that was the whole incident in Aruba. Now we got into Brian Higgins. So Brian Higgins testified that he also was in the funeral with Brian Albert for these fallen police officers, and they eventually made their way back to Canton. And Brian Higgins first went to the Canton Police Department because he had to switch his vehicle. So he got his own personal vehicle, and the issue that came up with this story on defense, on the cross-examination, was the fact that Brian Higgins did not move his vehicles, which needed to be moved anyway that night. He didn't move those vehicles when he was at the Canton Police Department right away after he came back from the funeral. Instead, what he did was he swapped vehicles, got his personal vehicle, met Brian Albert at the hillside, spent some time at the hillside, and then eventually went to the waterfall. He did acknowledge that Brian Albert is a good friend of his. He also said that he knew Karen Reed and John O'Keefe for about a year before the incident, so he was friendly with them. He did know them. And he was the first one eventually to go to 34 Fairview. And to be funny or whatnot, I'm not exactly sure, he decided to plow their driveway, even though it didn't really need plowing. So that's what he was doing there, but maybe because he was the first one there and he's just a little bored. So he did testify that he parked by the mailbox and then went inside or waited for Brian and Nicole Albert to come home and came inside. He testified, Brian Higgins, that he never went upstairs to look at any pictures with Brian Albert. They did look at pictures, but it was not upstairs. So a little bit of inconsistency there between Brian Albert's story and Brian Higgins' story, but they both testified that they looked at these Marine Corps pictures together. Just the question is, where exactly did they look at them? Now, here what's got a little interesting also is that Brian Higgins testified that there was a tall, black-haired male who may have come into the house. So everyone so far has testified that nobody came into the house except for the people that we all know already. Matt McCabe, Jennifer McCabe, Brian Albert, Nicole Albert, Brian Albert Jr., and his friends there. And Colin Albert was there for a little bit. No other people came into that house. John O'Keefe never came into that house. Certainly John O'Keefe never came into that house. But now Brian Higgins actually testified in an earlier proceeding that there may have been a tall, black-haired male who came into the house for a very short time, which is very interesting because, and he was trying to pass this off as, no, this would be Ryan Nagel or Rick D'Antonio who came to pick up Julie Nagel. But everyone else's testimony was that they never got out of their car. How can his memory be that it's possible that that person came into the house and that's what he remembers? Usually you remember who was there. So, but that was his testimony, that it's possible that this person came in. Now, he did leave between 12:30 and 1, and that's when he went back he left 34 Fairview and went back to the Canton Police Department because he had to move his vehicles, because that was Chief Brookwitz required him to move his vehicles and put them in the central of the parking lot so it wouldn't block the plows from plowing since there was a blizzard coming through. So the question was, why didn't he do this earlier? That was left really with not such a great answer. Now, he did call that. Why did he go back to the Canton Police Department? So at one proceeding, he said that the reason why he did that was because he had to do administrative duties. That's why he went back to the Canton Police Department. And then the defense attorney said, you mean you went to move cars? That's not called administrative duties. And he said, well, yeah, I would call that administrative duties. All right. Well, he also testified that there was no phone calls between him and Brian Albert at 2 o'clock in the morning. Now, the Celebrate report shows that there was a phone call made from Brian Albert to Brian Higgins at something like 2 o'clock in the morning, 2:22, 2:27 in the morning, something like that. And a call back from Brian Higgins to Brian Albert for 22 seconds. So there's a 22-second phone call. But Brian Albert already denied this. And, well, he said maybe it was a pocket dial. And Brian Higgins also said he never made any phone calls to Brian Albert. He certainly did not speak to him. Then he also asked if 22 seconds is long enough to have a phone call. And Brian Higgins said, no, it's not even long enough to have a conversation, which was not such a great answer either. All right. Then he woke up at 6:30 from phone calls from Brian Albert and Chief Brookwitz. He eventually heard what happened, so he went to 34 Fairview. Then he went to the Canton Police Department. So after he was at 34 Fairview, he spoke to some police officers. Then he went to Canton Police Department. And at one point he said in his testimony that he's not sure whether he went home or he went to the Canton Police Department. And it was very clear on cross-examination that his key card access was going off 18 different times throughout the day at Canton Police Department. There was no question that he was at the Canton Police Department, and this was a day that he was off. He was not supposed to be there, and he was hanging around there doing something. So that was the defense's point that he made there. Now, there was some flirtatious texts between Brian Higgins and Karen Reed. And it seems to be that Karen Reed was interested in hooking up with Brian Higgins. Now, what the reason for that was, she said that she thought he was hot. He said, I thought you're hot. I think you're hot too. And they had some sort of text messages like that. But nothing ever came of it. But she did seem to suggest that she was open to the idea of hooking up, but not anything further than that. It seems that he wanted a real deal relationship with Karen Reed, but she was not so interested. She seemed to have just wanted to hook up. Maybe she was mad at John for what happened to Ruba, or she's just in a bad emotional state, or she was just going through tough times with the whole situation with John. But that's what seemed to have been. And then what was interesting is that on the last text message of substance was January 23rd. So this wasn't a long, drawn-out affair where they just want to always spend time with each other and they're trashing their partners, and therefore they want to. There's some reasons that perhaps they would go and knock them off. This was a very short amount of time, very short period of time. Seems that she wanted to hook up, didn't go anywhere, and then she was done with it. Didn't seem like that would be the reason why she would want to knock off John O'Keefe. So not some great evidence there, but again, certainly not appropriate behavior by Karen Reed. Now, the last text was January 23rd also. So there's a whole about week that seems like Karen Reed just completely lost interest in Brian Higgins. And Brian Higgins certainly did not seem to have lost interest in Karen Reed, which is why after the waterfall, he texted Karen Reed, well. So, and again, at the waterfall, Karen Reed did not have any contact at all, any conversations or anything with Brian Higgins. Also, he testified that nobody ever searched his Jeep. No one ever felt that it was important to search his Jeep, so that wasn't done. And then also he testified that he destroyed his phone and his SIM card, albeit he did destroy them after the motion was denied to get access to his phone and SIM card, but he did nevertheless destroy it. He destroyed his phone and his SIM card. He drove to a military base to dump his trash, which included his phone and his SIM card there. All right, so that was Brian Higgins. Then we didn't hear this, but there was some testimony by Patrick and Kaylee, and they testified that the fights between John O'Keefe and Karen Reed were escalating closer to the time of John O'Keefe's death, but they never saw them physically fight. It was just verbal arguments that they had with each other. Then we had the blood alcohol experts testify, and essentially what it came down to was the fact that Karen Reed's alcohol level was somewhere between 0.135 and 0.292 at around 12:45 in the morning. So around 12:30, 12:45, 1 o'clock in the morning, that was what their estimation was for her blood alcohol to be, which is very high, which is very drunk. And the defense tried to poke some holes in this, but I think that everybody on the jury believes or understands that she was probably drunk. Okay, she's probably drinking a lot, and she was probably drunk. Everyone was drinking. That's probably what happened there. So that was that. And then also we heard the first time about an individual, a plow driver named Brian Loughran. As we know, this was the driver that was the plow driver that was assigned to 34 Fairview, and the defense brought out that Michael Proctor didn't even want to talk to him, but Brian Loughran was the plow driver who was supposed to be plowing 34 Fairview, and that's where we first heard his name. So we'll probably hear more about that later as the trial continues. So that is it. You are all completely caught up with all of the important testimony that came in this case so far. So thanks for watching. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, like if you want, join the membership Brother Counsel sidebars. We're going to have some very fun sidebars. So certainly join that if you can. Appreciate it. If you can't, that's fine. We'll still be putting out great content for the public. So don't worry, you are not going to be missing too much, just some extra fun. All right, well, that's it for now. Thank you, and we will see you next time.